Well, good evening and welcome to my favorite place in the world, the tropical forest in the Franklin Park Zoo. And I have to say I've been a zoo enthusiast almost all my life, because when I was a little boy growing up in London, lying in bed in my grandparents' apartment, at night I would hear the roaring of the lions and the barking of the sea lions in the nearby Regent's Park London Zoo. And for me, the zoo was a magical place. Growing up in London, which was then a very dirty, foggy, rainy, depressing city, just after the war, bomb sites everywhere, ruined houses, air raid shelters. London Zoo was like a window on the world. You would go to the zoo and you would see animals from all over the world. It was a place of color and exoticism. And I well remember at the zoo the arrival of the first panda to be seen out in the Western world, the only panda to be seen in a Western zoo outside China and Russia, Chi-Chi, the great excitement that caused. And that, in a sense, was what zoos were about. When the first zoos were founded in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in Paris and in London, it was a time when Europe was encountering the world, when America, after the travels of Lewis and Clark, was spreading across the continent. And animals from all over the world, from India and Southeast Asia, from Africa, from the Americas, were flooding into Europe. And the first zoos were set up as living encyclopedias, as museums of life, to show off all the animals in the world. As they said, a zoo must have something of everything. The purpose of the zoo was to introduce new and curious subjects of the animal kingdom. And zoos succeeded only too well. The animals they brought in caused crazes. The first giraffes that were seen at the zoos of Vienna and Paris and London inspired men to wear high, long-necked cravats à la girafe, and women to wear flouncy dresses with giraffe patterns. The first hippopotamus to be seen in Europe since the days of the Romans inspired a polka composed in his honor. So the zoos were really places where you saw animals and through them the world. They were encyclopedias of life. They succeeded, however, only too well. If you think about it, the gorilla, which is now such a familiar animal to us, was only discovered and described for science here in Boston. I've got competition now. The animals always intrude when you're doing live broadcasts. The gorilla was discovered here in Boston, first described from science from dry bones. The gorillas we know today are so well known because of the celebrity gorillas that were found in zoos. Susie in Cincinnati, Bamboo and Massa in Philadelphia, Guy in London, Alfred in Bristol, Bushman in Chicago, Lincoln Park. These gorillas put flesh on those dry bones in which the American naturalists first described the gorillas. So zoos succeeded very well because we now know a whole Noah's Ark of animals. We know about animals through seeing them in the zoo or from the literature and art that the zoos have inspired. And zoos indeed were founded, as I say, in the late 18th, early 19th century to archive, to repertoire all these animals flooding in. They were founded in an age of plenty. And they succeeded so much so that everybody expected their zoo to have a full complement of a Noah's Ark of African and other spectacular animals, charismatic megavertebrates. And every city wanted a zoo. And soon zoos became, in the last quarter of the 19th century in America, every city wanted a zoo. Because a zoo was part of being a city. A zoo was part of a park. But a zoo had essentially become entertainment. They had succeeded in making the familiar, the unfamiliar, familiar. They had succeeded in serving up these animals and making them known to us and making them expected. We expected to see them in a zoo. We expected a city to have a zoo. Now, in the late 19th and early 20th century, zoos realized that they had to do more to attract the public, to bring people in. So they developed the open plan zoo, the moated rock exhibit, where there was apparently no barrier between the humans and the other animals, no barrier between the exhibits. This was adopted by many American zoos, Detroit, Brookfield in Chicago, St. Louis. These American zoos followed the pattern of the Hagenbeck Zoo outside Hamburg, built in 1907, where the public was separated from the animals by a moat, seemingly no barrier. The animals were confined by rockwork, and the exhibits were staggered one upon the other. So you had panoramas, you had displays, you had a sense of being in Africa or in India or a polar landscape. But at the very time that zoos were proliferating over the world, at the very time that zoo exhibits were changing to give people a sense of the bounty of the Great Plains of Africa or America, at that very time, the age of abundance, the age of absolute prodigality of animal life flooding in, was giving way to the age of extinction. The late 19th century and the early 20th century, with colonization of the American prairies, with colonization of South Africa and Australia, was the beginning of the great age of extinction. The great charismatic megavertebrates, the animals that people expected to see in the zoo, were fast disappearing in the wild. And for a time, zoos were merely hapless witnesses of extinction. The very last quagga, the partially striped zebra of South Africa, the very last quagga died in the Amsterdam Zoo in 1883. The very last passenger pigeon, named Martha Washington, a bird of a species that had used to darken the American skies and cause whole forests to collapse under the weight of their nesting in their great migrations across the American West. The very last passenger pigeon of all died in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914, just on the eve of the Great War. And by a strange and cruel irony of fate, the very last Carolina parakeet died in the very same cage in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1918. Similarly, in 1936, the last thylacine, these strange animals that have the look of a wolf but the pouch of a kangaroo, died in the Hobart Zoo in Tasmania in 1936. So they were founded in a time of abundance. They were examples of the prodigality of nature. They introduced us to animals that we expected to see, but for a time they were just showing us the last of those animals. I'm glad to say that zoos are now changing. That zoos see the animals that they have in their collections, like Abby the tapir here, in whose enclosure I'm standing, are ambassadors for their congeners in the wild. They are acting as emissaries, as reminders of what we must do to save animals. To be relevant, zoos must switch from mere exhibitions, as they were in the age of abundance, to advocates, as they must be in the age of extinction. I'm all in favor of cloning the mammoth, but let us save the gorillas first. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.